Support for Consider This is provided by the University of Nebraska at Omaha College of Communication, Fine Arts, and Media.
Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Children, little and big, all alike, will be coming to see the fight. I'm the resurrected, the savior, the whole game. Every day I'm in the newspapers. You get tired of reading about me. All magazines, everything. I'm a big man.
How about this villain role? You're getting to be the villain, and Liston is getting to be the good guy.
First Liston was the villain, and didn't nobody like Liston. Liston was a thug. Liston was a gangster. Liston was this. Liston was that. Everybody wants to see Liston beat, and now all of a sudden Liston is the savior.
You know, I guess...
That's the way I like it. That makes me rumble. Don't we rumble? Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ah, rumble, young man, rumble. Hey! That's what we're going to do. We're going to rumble.
Listen now.
It is 1964. The man known then as Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. talks about the upcoming match with Sonny Liston. And the rest is, shall we say, history. Hi everyone, I'm Cathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, Mohammad Ali. Joining us to talk more about it are Chris Hardesty, boxing coach at Jackson's Boxing Club in Omaha, Raheem Yasseer, assistant director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at UNO, and Dr. Danish Bhatti, co-director of the Parkinsons Clinic at UNMC. Thank you all very much for being here and welcome to the program.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Chris, I want to start with you. Thoughts as you were watching that opening clip?
I think one thing that separated Ali from most boxers, especially in the past, today it's a different story, but one thing that separated him from a lot of those boxers in the past was he was very vocal. He wasn't afraid to show his opinions, and he wasn't afraid to take risks, was his thing. And that this is just my belief, but not just inside of the ring, but outside of the ring especially. And that's, I think a lot of people paid to see Ali win. A lot of people were Ali fans, but a lot of people paid to see him lose at the same time. Not everybody was fans of his opinions and his beliefs and the way that he went about things. But the flip side of the coin is he was able to bring the sport as mainstream as it is today by being vocal. And obviously inside the ring, he took the risks as far as fighting the best competition available at all times, which is something that I think today's fighters just don't do as much. You know, he would fight the prime fighters. He would fight he'd fight Sonny Liston, and he had Frazier, and he had Foreman, who was a younger, stronger fighter. I mean, these guys were just knocking people out. And he was the one that would not only call them out, he would take the risk and fight them, but he would do this 5-6 times a year, as opposed to today's fighters where they do it once or twice a year. And you have fighters today calling themselves the best ever. And I personally, as far as the best ever, I have Ali as my best heavyweight of all time. Top 3, maybe 4, kind of depends on what day it is, as far as all-time greats.
Let's take a look at a few photographs of then Cassius Clay. And as we're doing that, Chris, I want you to talk about the influence that you believe he had on the world of boxing.
Okay. As far as the world of boxing, when he started really becoming vocal, and this was after winning the Olympic gold. This is in 1960, I believe. He won the Olympic gold in the light heavyweight division. He comes back to the United States, and he was unable to eat in restaurants. So he was unable to do a lot of things that just in today's society just doesn't happen, And he was the very first person to become really, really vocal about things like that. If I'm not mistaken, the last 2 Olympics prior to that, the 1956 and the 52 Olympics, light heavyweights from the U.S. were both gold medalists in those Olympics. And they were both African American as well, but they weren't as vocal as Ali was. So I think what he did was he made it okay to be vocal, is what he did. He made it okay to be vocal and to kind of start setting stipulations and kind of raising the bar a little bit. And that carried on to the 80s when you had, you had fighters like Sugar Ray Leonard, stipulating how much money he was going to make, what size ring he was going to fight in, how many rounds they were going to go in championship fights, as opposed to I think it was in '87 when he fought Hagler. Championship fights in those days were 15 rounds, and he was able to stipulate a 12-round fight, which was unheard of in those days. But I think Ali kind of paved the way for African Americans to do that in not only the sport of boxing, but sports period, is what I believe. And then you look at fighters today like Floyd Mayweather is a perfect example of somebody who kind of created his own brand and his own label and started his own promotional company, and as opposed to promoters paying him X amount of dollars, he pays himself by being his own promoter. So fighters in the the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way up to today, fighters, I think in general, athletes would not be where they are today if it wasn't for somebody like Muhammad Ali.
So where were you when you first heard about this guy?
Probably in a boxing club, I imagine. Probably my dad's boxing club back in Northwest Indiana.
Wow.
I imagine so.
And how did you get involved with boxing?
My dad. My dad, he's been coaching boxing for longer than I've been alive. I just turned 36 last month, so probably around 38, 39 years he's been doing it. And I started boxing when I was a little kid, and I grew up in a gym, and I own a gym, and yeah, so.
So you talked a little bit about it, but just the whole evolution of boxing. You're relatively young, but you've got some history here in terms of how things morphed and evolved over the years. What would you say are maybe 2 or 3 of the biggest changes?
The biggest changes as far as the sport? I think one, the amount of belts that there are, which is something that kind of hurts the sport a little bit. Let's say you and I are both heavyweight boxers, and everybody wants to see us fight, and you have the WBC title. I might not want to fight you. I might be afraid of you for some reason, so I can go fight for the WBO title. That's one of the things that kind of hurts the sport. I think it was in '87 when, I think it was '87 when Duck Koo Kim fought Ray Mancini. Duck Koo Kim, I believe, he died in the ring or he died outside of the ring. And that was, after that fight, it kind of opened a lot of people's eyes as far as the amount of rounds that championship fights should go. But what a lot of people don't realize is it's not just the championship fights that are 15 rounds, but this is when professional fighters, when they train for a 15-round fight or a 12-round fight or even a 6-round fight, this involves hundreds of rounds of sparring. This is a lot of sparring, and a lot of times when fighters spar each other, if I'm fighting for a lightweight title, I want to spar somebody in a heavyweight class. I want to be able to take those punches from heavier fighters. That way when I get in with somebody my own size, those punches aren't going to hurt as much as what they did in the sparring. So people are sparring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rounds for a 15-round fight, and even if that fight goes 2 rounds and you take 30 punches to the head, a lot of people say, well, he hasn't, that wasn't really a tough fight for him, but people don't take into consideration the 2 months prior to that of taking lots of shots to the head. I think the amount of rounds is one of the biggest things that's changed from those days to today.
Okay, thank you, Raheem. A name change as well, right? Pretty significant in terms of his life. So talk with us, if you would, about the events that led up to the introduction to Muhammad Ali.
Okay, as we noticed, he was brought up in a environment or in a family which was not very famous, but so he had the potential of being talkative, and but he didn't. So later on, the events and the environment made him become vocal. He was inspired by 2 things. When he was converted into Islam, he studied Islam, and he was taught by his masters, Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, that Islam is peaceful and promotes peace like any other religion, and it's against oppression and depression, against cruelty and war, and especially in Islam, war is not allowed. It is allowed only when it is kind of defensive, or when it is a war against oppression and depression and unjust. So he was inspired by the teachings of Islam. So he became vocal about wars and things like that. In a situation in those days, the Vietnam War was very high, and people were inducted into the army. I was studying at UCLA at that time, and on campus every day there was a kind of anti-war slogans and speeches and things like that. So it was an atmosphere of resenting the war, because the people thought like the Iraq war was unjust. Mm-hmm. So he was inspired by that kind of thing, and especially when he was approached by the army to be inducted into our army, he said that he had nothing to do against the Vietcongs, and they were not considered any enemies to him, so he didn't have to go and bomb them and kill them and things like that. So this was one of the reasons that he became vocal against war, and he resented inductment into the army. Mm-hmm. The other thing was that his background brought up was a kind of oppressive, and he believed that his people were kind of oppressed by the other side, which is usually the whites, and therefore he sort of resented the plans and the approaches of the other side for carrying wars against other people. So these were the two factors that made him sort of vocal, and therefore he resented inductment, and he was ready to sacrifice for his belief in peace and anti-cruelty and oppression. So he was considering losing his title, championship, and license, and all those things for the sake of implementing his beliefs and thoughts. Mm-hmm. in those situations.
So your response to that, Raheem, I mean, what do you think about all that? Obviously drummed up quite a bit of controversy, got him into quite a bit of trouble as well.
Right.
As you're sitting there and explaining that to us, thoughts from your perspective?
The thing is, usually when people change their way of life, their attitudes, their careers and things like that, there are some who favors this kinds of action and some who mm-hmm. resent. And religion is a very important matter especially for the families who have been brought up under some kind of rules and regulations, and then to see one of their members mm-hmm. Converted into a different religion or believes in a different kind of faith, then of course it creates some problems for him, starting from the family and the friends and the associates and the people friends. But also there are some other people who are appreciating his conversion into things, like in this case, since he was a very famous champion in the world of Islam and in the world as a whole, people were sort of appreciating his change of faith and trying to join the people who are against war and against oppression and things like that. So he was received by some people warmly by accepting the faith of Islam and implementing its values into his life. And of course there were some resentments, but his stand is a sportsman, worldly famous champion, so it gave him some advantages to have more people on his side.
Yeah, because he eventually did return to the ring. And then, of course, the series Rocky came out, and we kind of lived a little through him in Apollo Creed. And we're going to put up a few photographs now, and I think our viewers will recognize, as we're putting these up, who we're seeing here. So,
Sylvester Stallone, the movie star, Rocky 1 and Rocky 2. And part of it was doing with the war in Afghanistan. So that's where he is. And I think they are talking about.
Yeah, so this was 1977. And there was a little surprise here on stage. And so those two were just kind of joking around after the surprise there. And I think we have one more. There you go. So we have Mohammed, right? And Sylvester. And of course, the gentleman on the right.
It's Carl Weathers. Carl Weathers is his name.
Is he the trainer or?
No, he actually he played Apollo Creed in the movie.
All right.
Yep, very familiar face. Excellent. And so it was things like this, right, that kind of launched him into. He had already been in a limelight, so to speak, but it really launched him into quite the limelight. And we have another series of photographs that we want to put up for our viewers, just in terms of kind of going back in Muhammad's life a little bit. So this first one is Motown, and our viewers might recognize some of the stars sitting there around him. And we'll go into, of course, most everybody knows who these folks are, the Beatles.
Beatles.
Right. And then we have Elvis Presley.
And then Ronald Reagan.
Yes. Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan. And this is with Prince.
Right.
Will Smith. And finally, and this is in the latter years, photograph with Celine Dion. Dr. Bhatti, of course, then came the news, right, that Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's disease. Why don't we start by having you give us your definition of Parkinson's?
Parkinson's disease is a brain condition that affects most notably movements. So it makes person more stiffer and slower, and both automatic movements and volitional or voluntary movements also significantly slow down. It's a common disease. More than 1 million people in the United States suffer from this condition, and it's called Parkinson's disease in recognition of Dr. James Parkinson, who first described it in his essay on shaking palsy.
Okay. Signs and symptoms of Parkinson's, doctor?
So the most recognized symptom or sign of Parkinson's disease is the typical shaking or tremor that is usually seen in the hands, and most often in one side, and was originally described as what was called a pill rolling tremor. So when they walk, they have this movements of fingers in a way where chemists used to roll pills in the past. But I think by far the most, the hallmark symptom and sign of the Parkinson's disease is the slowness of movements, and everything just slows down. So blinking is less often, face is not as expressive, writing can become smaller and slower, and walking with the shorter steps and loss of arm swings, all of these things are seen.
And finally, the causes of Parkinson's.
We're still not very sure. The current understanding is it's likely an interaction between environmental factors and genes, and many of them. Only 5% of patients have a gene that directly causes Parkinson's disease, like Michael J. Fox, but another big minority will have genes that can make it more likely for them to get Parkinson, but far majority of people get Parkinson's from complex interactions with many environmental factors that we're still trying to figure out.
So any surprise from where you're sitting that Muhammad Ali had been diagnosed with Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. I think the trap is that there is a strong sense that people with contact sports, especially boxing, have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's because of multiple injuries to their brain, and there is even a separate term used for those kind of Parkinson's or different types. So you would expect somebody who is in very active in boxing is at very high risk of getting that kind of Parkinson called dementia. pugilistic. But reading from information publicly available, I like to think he had regular Parkinson's disease, the way it progressed and how long he had it. However, only his doctor would know for better, for sure. So.
Yeah, those of us who saw video pictures of him in his latter years definitely, obviously, can notice a change in
That's right.
in what and doctor, if you just while we're
so as we talked about Parkinson's before, we can start seeing a posture change, and people stand more stooped and have difficulty walking, and can even affect balance in later year, causing instability. But Parkinson's can have the shaking, and the facial expressions are sometimes very easily recognizable, being very flat, expressionless.
Yeah, and I know, Chris, as you were talking about some of the changes, right, in regulation and so forth, I saw you nodding, Dr. Bhatti, and I'd just like the two of you maybe to talk a little bit about the importance of awareness of what's going on when you're in the ring or otherwise, in terms of why that change has been made. Just kind of raise the necessary awareness. I know when you were talking, Chris, any thoughts that were going through your head as Dr. Bhatti was explaining Parkinson's and some of the...
Well, I was just kind of happy that a doctor actually agreed with anything that I said.
I think the most significant point that he made, and I mean, he was talking about having too many titles and less fights and less intense. This is a trend in general. We're trying to be more wary of contact sports. There's in football, there's a lot of talk about this happening, and we know brain is sensitive to injury and being knocked over. And then, as Chris explained, that there's a lot of training that goes into it. So it's not just one match and being knocked for a few times in the match, but it's the hundreds of knocking that you have to take before. And people can pass out, people can have concussion, bleeding in the brain, and then death after or during the match will be the most dramatic implication. But people are just becoming more sensitive to it. It is being recognized more often.
I think the more it happens, the more it's recognized, just like anything else. There was a fighter maybe 6 months ago that was taking too many punches to the back of the head, and he's still in a coma today. So I mean, it happened throughout the whole fight, and I think the referee got suspended for letting it happen for such a long time. But I think the more that it happens, the more it's gonna be aware.
I guess there's a price to pay in everything. The bigger the goals are, bigger the objectives are, the more the price you have to pay. So,
so if you had athletes, or even just, I mean, it can happen to anyone, right? Sitting in front of you right now, Dr. Bhatti, what would be the takeaway message for them if they could remember one thing? What would you tell folks
in
about
terms
that?
of contact sports?
Sure. Well, in terms of concussions and head injuries and so forth, what's the biggest takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway that we have learned is that repeated insults are the ones that are the worst offenders, and they don't just add up, they multiply. So the best thing we have learned, which is the easiest thing to do, is to take a rest. So if you have been knocked out enough, you need to get your brain rest, and if you get knocked out twice, the rest is longer. And there are definitions on some supports that we have, but we are still learning more about it. But you have to rest your brain, let it bounce back, and the brain has this remarkable ability to do bounce back significantly. Well,
and we did hear that Muhammad Ali died of septic shock. So how do you define that, doctor?
Yeah, so septic shock is it's kind of a late stage of an infection that has spread to affect the cardiovascular system, so you cannot maintain your heart rate and blood pressure. And the infection can start anywhere. It could be a lung infection or urine infection, and it kind of spread and causes a significant morbidity and mortality. It's a very difficult stage to fight if the infection has gotten that worse that it's affecting your blood pressures. On a side note, Parkinson's disease itself is not considered a reason for death. Most people don't die of Parkinson's, they die with Parkinson, but it seems like Parkinson's disease patients in later stages do present with a lot of infections. So the recent study showed one of the most common reason for admission to hospital in late stage Parkinson was urine infections and something like that.
Of course, he passed away on June 3rd. And in just the minutes that we have remaining, you'll each probably have about a minute. I want to ask you, from your respective positions here, what you believe Muhammad Ali's legacy is. And Chris, we'll end with you. Doctor, what do you think?
So I think to me, because of my work with Parkinson, his biggest legacy is his fight with Parkinson and fight for Parkinson. So, he never let Parkinson slow him down. He was always very active, always in the limelight, always doing something. And similarly, he did fight for Parkinson a lot. Mohammad Ali Parkinson Center is a big testament for that. But he even inspired Michael J. Fox, and MJ Fox Foundation is now a big support for Parkinson. So it directly and indirectly has affected millions of people with Parkinson's, and that's the biggest legacy I can see.
First step people need to do with Parkinson's, doctor, if they suspect it, what should they do? Call the doctor, call you?
Yeah, I think getting properly diagnosed is very important. It can be missed and it can be overdiagnosed. Challenge is that there is no confirmatory test, so it's a clinical diagnosis, so it have to be done by an expert who knows what Parkinson's is.
Okay, thank you. Raheem, what about you? Legacy for Muhammad Ali?
Well, he used his faith, new faith, to get encouraged rather than getting discouraged. And he was not affected negatively by his not being accepted into the army and things like that. So I think he lives as a kind of champion who stood for his values and is for faith.
Thank you, Chris. About 15 seconds.
I have to agree with both of these guys here, definitely. I mean, as far as what he's done for the Parkinson's community, the Nation of Islam, and then myself, my aspect from it, the boxing community, just the overall champion in everything that he's accomplished in life.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. And as we leave, we want to give our viewers memorable moments of the man simply known as the greatest.
The greatest.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or email us at considerthis@tvmail.unomaha.edu.